There is a passage in the book of Isaiah, chapters 52 and 53, that has generated more commentary, more controversy, more theological argument than almost any other text in the Bible. It is called the Song of the Suffering Servants, and it describes a figure whose identity has been debated for 2,500 years. Who is this servant? Is it the prophet himself? Is it the nation of Israel personified? Is it an idealized future figure? The Jewish tradition has read it one way. The Christian tradition has read it another. The debate has never ended. But in this episode, I want to set that debate aside, not because it isn't important, but because Carl Jung gives us a way of reading this passage that speaks to something prior to the historical and theological argument. A way of reading it that asks, what is the psychological truth encoded in this figure? What does this archetype, the one who is wounded for others, who bears what is not his to bear, who heals through his own suffering, what does it tell us about how healing actually works? Let me read the central passage. It is Isaiah 53, and it begins at verse 2. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The servant is not someone who suffers because of his own wrongdoing. He suffers for the wrong of others. He carries what belongs to the collective, the iniquity laid on all, and the healing of the collective comes through the wound in him. Jung introduced the concept of the wounded healer in several places in his writing, drawing partly on the mythological figure of the healer god Chiron in Greek tradition. Chiron, who was himself wounded by a poisoned arrow and could not heal his own wound, but whose very woundedness made him the greatest healer in Greek myth. The paradox was explicit. The wound was the qualification. What Jung meant by the wounded healer is something more precise than simply the person who heals because they have suffered. He meant the person whose contact with their own wound, their genuine familiarity with pain, their willingness to carry what is difficult rather than defend against it, creates in them the capacity to bear witness to the pain of others in a way the unwounded cannot. The unwounded healer, the person who has never genuinely suffered, who has only learned about suffering theoretically, is, in Jung's observation, less effective and not more, because they cannot meet the patient in the place where the patient is. They can observe from outside, they cannot accompany. The wounded healer, by contrast, has been where the patient is. Not necessarily in the same circumstances, the specifics of the wound do not need to match, but in the same territory, the territory of genuine pain, genuine diminishment, genuine darkness. And from within that territory, they can say, not through words, but through their very presence, I know this place. You are not alone here. The suffering servant of Isaiah is wounded in a way that produces healing in others, not because his suffering is simply transferred to them, not as a transaction of pain, but because his willingness to carry what others have not been able to carry creates a new possibility for them. By his wounds we are healed. His woundedness is what heals. The wound is the medicine. This is a paradox that defies the usual logic of healing. Normally, we expect the healer to be well, to have something that the patient lacks, to give from a position of fullness. But the servant heals from a position of emptiness. He heals from the wound. Jung observed this paradox in the practice of psychotherapy, and he was honest about it in his own autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. The analyst who has not undergone their own deep analysis, who has not confronted their own shadow, their own wound, their own darkness, is less effective than the analyst who has. Not because the patient needs to know the analyst's history, but because the analyst who has been through the depths has something in them that the patient's unconscious recognizes, the quality of someone who has been in the same territory and survived. He called this quality the quality of the healer shaped by their own wound, one of the most important and least acknowledged elements of the therapeutic relationship. But Isaiah's servant carries something beyond even the personal wound. He carries the collective wound. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is not simply the individual therapist who heals from personal experience of pain. This is a figure who takes on what the whole community cannot bear to carry: the accumulated guilt, the unprocessed transgression, the pain that no individual can acknowledge as their own. Jung wrote about the figure of what he called the scapegoat, the ancient mechanism by which communities deal with the collective anxiety, guilt, and shadow by projecting it onto a single individual or group and expelling or destroying them. The scapegoat mechanism is, in his analysis, one of the most universal and most destructive patterns in human collective psychology. It allows the community to feel cleansed while actually solving nothing, because the shadow that has been projected outwards does not disappear with the scapegoat, it returns. The suffering servant in Isaiah is a figure who transforms the scapegoat mechanism. He carries the collective wound, not because it is projected onto him and he is expelled, but because he voluntarily takes it up and bears it. The difference is crucial. The scapegoat is a vehicle for the community's evasion. The servant is a vehicle for the community's transformation. And the transformation is possible precisely because the bearing is genuine. He does not defend against the weight. He does not pretend it is not there. He carries it fully and is shaped by the carrying. And in the shaping, something is released in those who could not carry it themselves. This is one of the most difficult ideas in the whole of this series, and I want to be careful with it. I am not suggesting that suffering is inherently redemptive, that pain always produces healing, that woundedness always generates wisdom. It does not. Suffering can destroy as surely as it can deepen. What Jung's concept of the wounded healer insists upon is something more specific, that the wound which is entered willingly, or at least accepted genuinely, without the flight into denial or the collapse into victimhood, can be transformed into a source of understanding that could not have come any other way. The wound that is carried consciously rather than suppressed or projected becomes a kind of knowing. This is what the servant carries. Not suffering as an end in itself, but the willingness to remain in the place of pain rather than leaving it for the one who has inflicted it, or expelling it onto someone else, or numbing it into non-existence. The willingness to carry it fully into the full knowledge of what it costs. He was familiar with pain, familiar, not distant from it, not defended against it, not above it, familiar, as one is familiar with a place one has lived in for a long time. Near the end of the passage, there is a verse that I find psychologically profound. He will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servants will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. By his knowledge, not by his power, not by his perfection, by his knowledge. The knowledge that comes from the wound, the knowing that only the familiar can have. The servant does not heal through force or authority or even virtue in the conventional sense. He heals through what he knows. And what he knows because he has been there. This is the deepest expression of the wounded healer, the one who has descended far enough into the darkness that they can accompany others in it, who has been sufficiently familiar with the pain that their presence in the midst of it is itself a form of healing.